Sinnantu Vishve Amritasya Putraha Ayedhamani Divyani Tasto Vedahametam Purusham Mahantam Aditya Varanam Tamasa Parasta Tvame
Dharmecha, Arthecha, Kamecha, Mokshecha, Bharatarshava, Yadi hasti tadanyatra, Yadne hasti nakutrachit. The ancient philosophers of India believed in 4 objectives of life: dharma, the rightness of things, the cosmic order, justice; artha, material prosperity; kama, enjoyment through engaging with the world; and moksha, release through liberation from the world. And the Mahabharata declares about the 4 objectives of life. What is not stated in the Mahabharata is not stated anywhere at all. The Mahabharata calls itself Itihaasam Puratanam. Thus indeed it was in times past. There are no definitive claims to historicity of persons and events in the narrative. However, there is a hint that some of the narrative is an attempt to cull from the remembered tradition that which may have happened, even if what is culled is disordered in the retelling. Undoubtedly, among the more attractive features of the epic, although historically tantalizing, are its many enigmas. Some, however, suggest the occasional facet of a historical past. Authorship of the Mahabharata is attributed to Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa, a Brahmin of uncertain antecedents, born of the sage Parasara and a fisherwoman Satyavati, and of whom it is said that he sired Dhritarashtra and Pandu. Authorship and fatherhood are coalesced, and in effect, Vyasa is narrating the lives of his own sons and grandsons. Although these sons and grandsons are constantly referred to as the bull among the Bharatas in the epic, in reality they have no blood connection with the lineage of the Bharatas. The blood connection ended with Bhishma. The Dasharagya, the battle of the 10 Rajas described in the Rig Veda, has been viewed by some modern scholars as the seminal event for the war at Kurukshetra. Some of the clans from the Vedic corpus, such as the Bharatas, Purus, Yadus, and the Kuru Panchalas, reappear in the Mahabharata as lineage ancestors of the epic protagonists, but not necessarily in the same situations. Panini, in the 4th century BCE, refers indirectly to grammatical constructions associated with words such as Mahabharata, Yudhishthira, Arjuna, and Vasudeva. The composition was doubtless in the nature of a slow accretion, as is characteristic of the early epic genre virtually anywhere. Nevertheless, at some point, it was brought together. Tradition has it that a small text, the Jaya, became larger, the Bharata, and the larger became larger still, the Mahabharata. It is therefore virtually impossible to calculate a precise date for the events and to define an epic period in ancient history, as was once done. The epic maintains that the war at Kurukshetra took place on the cusp of Kali Yuga. This has been dated as equivalent to 3102 BCE. Dates calculated on the basis of genealogical lists of Kshatriya lineages in the Puranas usually work out to between 1200 to 1000 BCE. The archaeological evidence of a heavy silt deposit at the site of Hastinapur, which has been linked to the epic reference to a flood after the war, points to a date of 800 BCE. Mention of Yavanas, Shakas, Hunas would be interpolations in the later BCs and early centuries CE. V.S. Sukthankar, to whom the critical edition of the epic owes much, argued that its composition ranges from 400 BCE to 400 CE. Attempts have been made to correlate readings in astronomy with references to planetary configurations in the epic. These differ and would not relate to the text as a whole, but to particular segments carrying the reference. Diversity of the dates also makes it difficult to attribute authorship to a single author. The meaning of Vyasa is, interestingly, one who edits and arranges.
There are specific references to genealogical trees. So I can date the number of years that have elapsed between the crowning of Parikshit and the crowning of Mahapadmananda, which is of course externally validated in some sense from the Greek sources. So these are history, except for Parjitar many years ago and Pusalkar after that, no one has bothered to look at these texts, the texts I am talking about, as Itihaasa history, because they are typically dismissed as myth.
What is important is not so much the date and the event that comes out of these texts. What is important is to see what is the kind of society they're talking about. And so now we are arguing, as indeed I have tried to argue, that the Mahabharata is essentially a clan-based society.
Okay.
And therefore one is not interested in whether it's historical or not, but it's telling us a great deal about how clans functioned and how different social items, itineraries, ideas were brought in, and how the story changed in order to accommodate new social ideas and new social forms. That seems to be much more logical and to the point than going on battling over something which you, at the moment, given the evidence, cannot prove either way.
Many scholars believe that the Mahabharata was retold very differently by all of its many authors in the long line of literary descent. It is so extremely fluid that there is no single Mahabharata. There are hundreds of Mahabharatas constantly retold and rewritten, both in Sanskrit and in vernacular dialects. It grows out of oral tradition and then grows back into oral tradition. It flickers back and forth between Sanskrit manuscripts and village storytellers, each adding gemstones to the old mosaic, constantly reinterpreting it. Clearly, no single author could have lived long enough to put it all together, but that does not mean that it is a miscellaneous mess with no unified point of view. However diverse its sources, for several thousand years, tradition has regarded it as a conversation among people who know one another's views and argue with silent partners. It is a contested text, but the contradictions at its heart are not mistakes of a sloppy editor, but enduring cultural dilemmas that no author could ever have resolved. It has been suggested that the Mahabharata is both a foundational text and a transitional one. It represents the cusp of two ages, Dwapara and Kali. It oscillates between Vedic gods and the new supreme gods, Vishnu and Shiva. It also represents the transition of the political landscape from one dominated by small clans and republics to the rise of powerful royal dynasties. Philosophically also, it represents the transition from the old Vedic belief system to a new synthesized belief system informed and influenced significantly by the ancient shamanic traditions of India. Performing sacrifices was still important, but a new idea of an intimate God-human relationship based on devotion, bhakti, was taking shape. Heaven was still a coveted goal, but it was deemed inferior to practicing the great yoga of final release, through which one can know the ultimate reality, Brahman. Some scholars argue that though the central battle of the epic could be dated to a much older time in history, the epic itself took shape in an essentially Maurya India. Many scholars have seen the shadow of the historical Ashoka the Great in the many conversations on dharma between Bhishma and Yudhishthira, as narrated in the Shanti Parva.
For instance, the most recent work on this has been in a section of the Mahabharata, the Shanti Parva, when one of the heroes, Yudhishthira, is asked to take over the kingship. And he says, no, I don't want to be king, I want to be a renouncer, I'm going away. And he is then persuaded slowly and gradually. And the whole discourse is one on kingship and renunciation, which is of course a fundamental discourse in Buddhism, power and renunciation, that goes on. And there are some historians who are today saying that maybe Yudhishthira had in mind the image of Ashoka when he said, I don't want to be king, I would rather not have the power but be an ascetic and have a different kind of authority altogether. Because let's not forget that in Indian society, renouncers and ascetics were not people who just disappeared on the wayside.
The most powerful philosophical response to a whole range of issues related to dharma, violence, war and renunciation in the Mahabharata occurs in the Bhagavad Gita, Song of the Lord. The Gita, which is part of Bhishma Parva, the sixth book of the epic, weaves together strands from the philosophies of Samkhya, Yoga and Vedanta with the ideas of duty and religious devotion, bhakti. The text can be seen as Brahmanism's response to Buddhism, a response marked by the acceptance and absorption of some Buddhist ideas such as impermanence and suffering, as well as a strong rejection of others such as the denial of the soul. Thus, the Bhagavad Gita reconciles many seemingly irreconcilable elements, including dharma and moksha. Perhaps it is dharma which is at the heart of the Mahabharata. Dharma is many things in the epic. He is of course a god who subjects his son Yudhishthira to many tests. But more than that, dharma is justice, the cosmic order and the rightness of things. The Mahabharata defines different kinds of dharma to be practiced by different groups in society. Swadharma, Yoga Dharma, Kula Dharma, Raja Dharma, and of course Sadharana Dharma to be practiced by all. But is it easy or even possible to practice dharma? Some scholars believe that Duryodhana represents an older idea of kingship in which brute force and magical religious powers are prominent, while Yudhishthira represents a newer idea of kingship in which politics struggles to come to terms with dharma, with ethics. But does Yudhishthira too not fail the test of dharma with his lying on the battlefield and his fatal attraction to dicing? Does Krishna also not fail the test of dharma in some of his actions during the course of the great battle? Does anyone know what dharma is? The Mahabharata says, Dharmasya tatyam nihitam guhayam. The code of dharma is hidden in a cave. At the end of the epic, Vyasa, the great bard, throws up his two hands and cries, Urtha bahur biraumyesha nachakaschit shrinoti me dharmadarthascha kamascha Sakimarthang na sevyate. I throw up my hands and cry loudly that artha, prosperity, and kama, enjoyment of the world, come only from dharma. But why does no one practice dharma? Maybe because it cannot be practiced in this world of imperfection, where even Yudhishthira, the son of Dharma, falls short of Dharma's exalted standards. Is this why even Krishna, the Supreme Lord, at the end of 18 chapters of the Gita, finally exhorts Sarvadharmam Parityajya Mamekam Sharanam Braja?
জিজ্ঞাসিল রুরু তবে জনকের স্থানে সর্পযজ্ঞ জন্মের জয় কইল কি কারণে। প্রমতি বলেন বৎস কর অবধান, মহাশ্চর্য সর্পযজ্ঞ অপূর্ব আখ্যান। যাযাবর বংশে জন্ম জরৎকারু মুনি, যোগেতে পরম যোগী ত্রিজগতে জানি। স্বচ্ছন্দে ভ্রমিয়া গেল দেশ দেশান্তরে, উলঙ্গ উন্মত্ত বেশ সদা অনাহারে। একদা অরণ্য মধ্যে ভ্রমে তপোধন, এক গোটা গর্ত দেখে অদ্ভুত রচন।